January 17th, 194,429,000 feet above the frozen fields of Germany. The air was thin and cold enough to crack bone. Ice crystals formed on cockpit glass, and the sun, pale and distant, cast long shadows across a formation of B-17 flying fortresses, droning eastward through fustil sky. Below, the snow-covered countryside stretched like a wrinkled map. Villages reduced to black dots against endless white. The bomber crews could feel it in their chest. The tightness. The waiting. They were deep in enemy territory now, and the Luftwaffe was coming. Among the escort fighters weaving above the bombers flew a single P-47 Thunderbolt, tail number 21,106,827, piloted by a 23-year-old farm boy from Ferndale, Washington, named Robert S. Johnson. He had pale blue eyes, age-a-line carved from depression-era hardship, and hands that once Milkutko's now gripped a control stick in the center of 7 tons of American machinery. Johnson was already an ace, 7 confirmed kills painted in neat rosbaneth. His canopy, but on this frozen morning, he would do something no Luftwaffe pilot could comprehend. Something that would be dissected in debriefings 4 months afterward, whispered about in Bavarian beer halls, and ultimately dismissed as impossible. He would survive what should have been certain death, and in doing so, destroy the myth of German Ariel. Invincible Ithra, incomprehensible endurance. The German fighter pilots, who rose to meet the American formation that day were among the most experienced in men like Overlitten Franz Stiegler and his comrades had cut their teeth over the Channel, over North Africa, over the endless Russian steppe. They had faced Spitfires and Hurricanes, Yaks and Lai. They knew the ballet of aerial combat, the geometry of deflection shooting, the physics of the high-speed stall, the exact moment when a pilot's nerve would break and he would try to run. They climbed through the clouds with the of predators who had never encountered prey they couldn't kill. There. Follow Wolf 190s, Messerschmitt 109s were masterpieces of engineering. Sleek, fast, deadly. They expected the Americans to scatter, to jettison their bombs, and dive for home the moment the first tracers stitched across the sky. What they encountered instead was a mething that violated every principle, the Luftwaffe's tactical manual. The attack began conventionally enough. A swarm of 4 FW-190 shrilled in from the bombers 6 o'clock. High. The standard approach, cannon and machine gun, already hammering. Johnson saw them coming. Every fighter, pilots, bandits with altitude and speed advantage, and broke hard left to intercept. His wingman, a nervous lieutenant, on his 3rd mission, broke each wrong direction and disappeared in death scrum. Johnson was alone now. The way he preferred it. He pushed the Thunderbolt's nose down, building speed, and met the lead 190 hidden in a closing speed of over 700 miles per hour. Both pilots fired, but missed. They flushed past each other with inches to spare. Then the second 190 caught him. The burst came from Johnson's 4 o'clock, a lining-off tracer fire that seemed to move in slow motion. Orange pearls, arsing through space. He felt the impacts bore. He heard them, heavy metallic thems, as 20mm cannon shells punched through the Thunderbolts. Aluminum skin, his right wing erupted in jagged holes. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the canal, freezing instantly in the -40. The stick went stiff in his hands. Johnson hauled back on it anyway, pulling into a climbing turn that should have torn the wings off. But the Thunderbolts held together. It always held together. That was the genius of Republic Aviation's design. A radial engine as big as a Volkswagen wrapped in armor plate bolted to an airframe built like a bridge. German pilots called it the jug with grudging respect. You could shoot a Thunderbolt to piece. They would keep flying. Johnson needed every ounce of that durability. Now theft wolves swarmed him. 3, then 4, then 6 gray shapes, orbiting like wolves around a wounded elk. They took turns making firing passes, disciplined and methodical, conserving ammunition, waiting for the American to make the fatal mistake, try to run or freeze up or simply run out of sky. Johnson didn't know of these things. Instead, he began to fly in a pattern that made no sense. He was fish style. He flew Thunderbolt, like a drunk driver on a mountain road, nose high, then low, yawing left and right in random, unpredictable lurches. His airspeed bled off to nothing, then surged back as he pointed the nose down and firewalled the. He climbed until the big Pratt & Whitney engine choked and cuffed, then dove until the airframe shuddered on the edge of. He spun the aircraft on its vertical axis, presenting his armored belly to attackers, then snapped it level and accelerated in the opposite. There was no pattern, nor rhythm, no predictability. It was cows with a purpose. The German pilots couldn't get a clean shot. Every principle of aerial good on predicting your target's via their position, leading the target as Stu hunters do, but Johnson gave them nothing to predict. One moment, he was glimming. The next falling. The next getting sideways in a maneuver that would have stalled the aircraft, but somehow didn't. The Luftwaffe pilots burned through their ammunition in frustration, tracers chasing the Thunderbolt's tail, but always arriving a fraction of a second too late, punching empty air. They radioed each other in confusion. Was the American hit? Was his aircraft damaged? Why didn't he? Johnson's canopy was gone now, blown away by a 20mm shell. The wind screamed through the cockpit at 200 miles per hour. His instruments were shot to pieces. Altimeter frozen, airspeed, indicator dead, compass spinning uselessly. Blood from a scalp wound ran into his eyes. His left arm hung numb and useless, where shrapnel had torn through the muscle. But his right hand still gripped the stick, and his right foot still worked its rudder pedals, and his brain, running on adrenaline and pure survivalincing, kept calculating angles and and the one equation that muttered. Stay alive for 10 more seconds, then 10 more after that. The engagement lasted 23 minutes. 23 minutes of continuous combat at altitudes ranging from 28,000 feet down to the deck across 30 meters of German countryside. By the time Johnson finally broke contact and limped westward toward the channel, 17 Luftwaffe fighters had taken at least one pass at him. He had been hit 201. His aircraft looked like it had been attacked with a sledgehammer. Wings shredded, tail riddled with holes, fuselage torn open in a dozen places, oil and hydraulic fluid, and fuel leaking from wounds that should have been fatal. The propeller was bent. The gun bays were empty. He'd fired every round, trying to keep the and yet the Pratt & Whitney still turned. The wings still generated lift, and Robert Johnson still breathed. He crash-landed at the first British airfield he could find, a grass strip. On the coast, the Thunderbolt skidding to a halt, with both tires blown and the landing gear half collapsed. When the British ground crew pulled him out of the cockpit, they counted their holes and stood in silence. The intelligence officer who debriefed him wrote, in the mission report, pilot states aircraft was drunk bladder and due to control damage. Miraculous survival. The report was forwarded to 8 then to the Pentagon, where engineers studied it and shook their heads in wonder. But the real story was being written in Germany. The Luftwaffe pilots who had engaged Johnson landed at their bases confused and angry. They had followed correct doctrine. They had executed textbook attacks. They had scored hits, many hits, and still the American had escaped. In the debriefing rooms, flight leaders questioned their men sharply. Had they aimed correctly? Had they closed too effective range? Were they certain of their ammunition loads? The pilots insisted they had done everything right. The problem was, Gate. It had flown like a madman, like Simeon, with no regard for the laws of physics or self-preservation. One pilot said, like a drunk. The phrase stuck, in subsequent intelligence summaries, German analysts noted it. American pilots, particularly, were survive attacks that should have been lethal by flying, inerratic, undisciplined, pattersinkens, with accepted fighter tactics. What the Germans didn't understand, what they couldn't understand because it contradicted their entire philosophy of air combat, was that Johnson's drunk flying wasn't panic or desperation. It was a innovation born from abundance. The Luftwaffe trained its pilots to fly with Prussian precision, to execute maneuvers from the manual, to conserve ammunition and fuel because both were. They flew beautiful, deadly, efficient patterns because that's what you did when every bullet mattered, and every gallon of fuel was rationed. German pilot training, once legendary for its thoroughness, had been cut from 12 years to 6 months by 1944. New pilots arrived at frontline units, barely 100 hours of flight time, clutching doctrine manuals like religious texts, because that was all they had. They had been taught that aerial combat was a science, angles and speeds and probabilities, and that survivor came from perfect execution. But Robert Johnson had been trained at American flight schools, where aviation gasoline flowed like water, where pilots burned thousands of gallons learning to handle an aircraft at the edge of its envelope, where instructors encouraged students to experiment, to push limits, to discover what the machine could do beyond what the manual said. Johnson had 300 hours in the Thunderbolt before he ever saw combat. He had spent interior off turns, deliberately stalling the aircraft, spinning it, recovering it, learning its quirks and forgiveness. He knew the Thunderbolt could take a punishment, because he'd read reports of other pilots who had brought them home on a prayer and spare parts. He knew the big radial engine would keep running Beckel's American engines, where he built with tolerances that allowed for battle damage. He knew who could throw the aircraft into maneuvers that would rip apart a 109 because Republic had built the Thunderbolt for a 230 pounds pilot in full gear, pulling maximum Gs in a panic turn, not for a 160 pounds pilot flying by numbers. In short, Johnson survived the PCAOs. He could afford to be wasteful. Wasteful with fuel, wheat, altitude, with the structural limits of his aircraft. The Thunderbolt was built to be abused. American industry would build another if this one broke. In 1944 alone, Republic Aviation produced 4,186 P-47 Thunderbolts. That's 11 aircraft per day! Every single day, rolling off assembly lines in Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana. If John Soom's plane had gone down, another would have replaced it within hours. The Germans, by contrast, were producing fighters in caves and dispersed factories, hiding from Allied bombers, scourging for aluminum and chromium and rubber. Every wolf that took off was precious, irreplaceably. That philosophy, that abundance-driven approach to warfare was incomprehensibly Germans who had grown up in a nation where everything was rationed, where efficiency was survival, where a wasted bullet could mean the difference between victory and defeat, to fly drone, to waste fuel in random maneuvers, to fire all your ammunition in a city. These were sins against the Germanic ideal of controlled, measured, efficient violence. But to the Americans, it was just Tuesday. Over the following months, the American fighter pilots, particularly the Thunderbolt and Mustang, developed a reputation for surviving impossible odds through sheer unpredictability. They would skid, they would snap roll, they would dive at speeds that should have torn their aircraft apart, and they would come home. The Luftwaffe's kill rates began to decline, not because German pilots lost skill, but because American pilots stopped playing by rules that favored the Germans. They invented new rules, chaotic rules rules written in hydraulic fluid, and thousands of hours of training time that most Luftwaffe pilots rushed through shortened courses as Theor turned against Germany. Simply didn't. The contrast became symbolic of something larger. The Germans had entered the war with the world's most advanced aircraft, the most experienced satellites, the most sophisticated tactics. They had the Bf-1, which had dominated skies over Spain and Poland and France. They had pilots who were veterans before the first American fighter crossed the Atlantic, but they were fighting a war of scarcity. Limit fuel from Romanian oil fields, vulnerable to bombing. Limited pilots' best training took resources that they didn't have. Limited aircraft because of every factory was a target. The Americans, by contrast, were fighting a war of plenty. They had fuel from Texas wells that could supply the world twice over. They had pilots trained at dozens of bases across a continent no enemy bomber could touch. They had factories in Detroit and Seattle and Los Angeles, pumping out aircraft faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. Robert Johnson, be a cometh embodiment of that truth. After the Brunswick mission, he flew 61 more combat sorties. He survived being shot down twice more. Once over the Channel, where a British destroyer fished him out of the water. Once over France, where he evaded capture and walked back to Alliedines through the resistance network. Heshid downed 20 more German aircraft, bringing his final tally to 27. But more importantly, Hesser came home, and every time landed that battered Thunderbolt. Every time he walked away from an aircraft that should have been his, he proved that American abundance was more powerful than German precision. Years after the war, a German pilot who had been in the Brunswick incident was interviewed by a military historian. He described the encounter in careful detail, still puzzled after. "We hit him," the German said. "We hit him many times. He should have a gun down, but he kept flying like he didn't know he was supposed to die. Like Earth rules didn't apply to him." The historian asked if the German thought Johnson had been a great pilot. The old man thought for a long time before. He was not elegant, definitely said. He was not classical. Bov was free. Free to fly badly, to waste fuel, to break his airplane because he knew there would be another one. Whenever had that freedom. That was the difference. That difference. The freedom to be wasteful, to experiment, to survive through abundance rather than precision, was stamped into every rivet of every aircraft that rolled off American production lines. It was baked into theater programs that gave pilots hundreds of hours in the cockpit before they saw combat. It was embedded in the supply chains that kept fighters fueled and armed and repaired no matter how far from home they flew. And it was carried in the hearts of young men like Rob, who grew up in a country that taught them the sky had no limits, and that rules were meant to be rewritten. The Thunderbolt Johnson flew that day. Tail number 21,106,827 was repaired and returned to service. It flew 43 more missions before bunny and eventually scrapped for aluminum in 1946. But the lesson it taught that American pilots could win not by being better tacticians, but by being impossible. Tokyo echoed through every air battle. Fourth, rest of the war. The Germans shot down thousands of American aircraft. They claimed victory after victory in the daily communiques, but they could never shoot down enough. For every Thunderbolt they destroyed, 5 more appeared. For every pilot, 10 more arrived with more training and more fuel and more ammunition than the mission. Strictly required because abundance was the American doctrine, and waste was a weapon in itself. In the end, the Germans lost, not because the pilots lacked courage or skill, but because they faced an enemy who could afford to fly drunk, who could afford to be reckless and wasteful and tactically imperfect. Because behind every pilot stood the full industrial might of a continent that had never known strategic bombing, never known shortage, never known the fear that the next bullet might be the last one available. The Luftwaffe fought with desperate, the Americans fought with careless abundance. And in that contrastly the entire story of the war. One side counting bullets, the other side forgetting to count it all. The sky above Brunswick is quiet now. Commerciages trace contrails across the same space where Robert Johnson fought for his life. But somewhere in that cold blue, in space, between clouds, the echo of Aperton. Whitney radial engines, drunk on freedom, impossibleto, killing a truce. The Germans learn. Too late, that abundance, not elegance, wins wars. And that sometimisty, most dangerous enemy is the one who doesn't know he's supposed to lose.